We are in the midst of history. Political turmoil, an unprecedented election, an assassination attempt have all left us wondering what is going to happen within these crucial and chaotic next 4 months. Returning to the show to help us unpack and understand it is Luke Nichter, author of The Year That Broke Politics and professor of history and presidential studies at Chapman University. We are currently in uncharted territory, but looking back on the 1968 presidential election may help us understand what lay ahead. Enjoy the episode. Thank you for coming back on the show on such short notice. I know these are crazy times, but we're very excited to have you. So thanks for coming back on the show.
Oh, glad to do it. Thank you.
So obviously we are in uncharted waters here, unprecedented territory with the 2024 election. Last time I had you on the show, we were talking about your book, The Year That Broke Politics, which seems ever more relevant as the days go on with this crazy news cycle. Every day something's happening. I know one of the things we talked about last time was when looking back on the 68 election, it was like every month something huge happened. And now it seems like every day something huge is happening. But the big news right now, Biden just stepped down yesterday. So what do you make of this current situation now that Biden stepped down?
Yeah, it's funny. The way you set that up there is really, really good because when we spoke last time, we spent most of the conversation talking about all the similarities between 1968 and 2024, but there were two obvious dissimilarities at that time. Not that long ago. I referred to the fact that in 2024 we had not really seen any kind of political violence, and secondly, that historically speaking, history doesn't predict the future, but sometimes it's good at illuminating our possible future paths. That March was the month to watch because Truman stepped down in March 29 of 1952, and LBJ stepped down very aware of what Truman did on March 31st, 1968. And that was late, but gave their party enough time to still organize and have a semi orderly process to choose a nominee. Last time we talked, it's the second dissimilarity was it seemed that Biden wasn't inclined to follow LBJ and get out of the race. And here it is, just within the span of less than 2 weeks. Both of those dissimilarities are erased. So I think my quick take on Biden, and of course, my book was written 55 years after 1968. So it's probably going to take a little while for us to figure out what's really going on behind the scenes, because I think that's where the answer is. And I think the lessons of history suggest to me that President Biden had made up his mind, or at least was seriously considering stepping down before the rest of us learned about it. Like LBJ, who was ready about 2 months before to do it and just was waiting for the right timing. Some people have suggested to me just in the last couple days that was it George Clooney's letter on July 10th? What was it that started, even though the White House denied the possibility? Like LBJ, who went on television and gave a 30-minute speech not about withdrawing but about Vietnam, and just added those last couple of surprise lines saying he was going to get out of the race. Biden did something similar. We didn't see Biden yesterday. There were no still photos or videos. But from what I've read, his inner circle learned only at 1:45 p.m. Eastern that he was going to release that letter, which he released 1 minute later at 1:46. And just like LBJ, there was that surprise announcement, not very long, right to the point. So as it turns out, he did do what LBJ did. But at the same time, this is unprecedented because since World War II, we could go through several of examples of presidents who withdrew or vice presidents who were in this awkward challenge to gather a campaign very quickly. But none of these examples prepare Vice President Harris for what she's about to do because she has less time than they do. She has a party that's at least as divided as those were. And of course, unlike any examples from history, it takes $1 billion to run for president. So she has huge hurdles that probably there's no exact historical precedent or path for her to follow.
Yeah, it's really hard to find. I think political commentators can try to do their best to predict what's happened, but this is, like we said, this is unprecedented. It's very difficult to predict where it's going to go. I think all we can do is look back to 68, which was like kind of the closest election to, like you said, illuminate the path forward. And I hope that you do make a lot of money from this book, because this book is very relevant now. So I hope that, people will buy this book and read it to look back on. But you mentioned the difference here between LBJ and Biden, and I know a lot of Republicans are hammering him on this, and I do think it's an important point to make. LBJ came on national television, spoke for 30 minutes with his face in front of the American people, and Joe Biden releases this on Twitter. Of all things, he's announcing that he's stepping down from the presidential race in a screenshot of a letter under his personal letterhead and not the White House letterhead, which I do think is important on Twitter. So, what do you make of that? Is it significant that Biden issued this statement under his personal letterhead on Twitter?
As a person who does records and a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests, I notice the letterhead and also the unusual signature right away. And I don't know what to make of it, either one. I think my speculation or my commentary are, by issuing it on, his personal stationery instead of White House stationery, it's possible that the message he intends to send is that this was a withdrawal from a political position, but not a withdrawal from the White House. And he might have anticipated that as soon as this letter is released, there would be those who would argue that if you're not fit to run for reelection, then are you fit to be president during your final 6 months? So it might have been in anticipation of that. The signature I can't quite figure out. I've had part-time presidential appointments in the last two administrations, including earlier in the Biden administration. I still serve on the federal government's FOIA advisory committee, which sort of lives under the National Archives. I have a letter from Biden kind of thanking me for my service. It might be auto-penned. I expect it to be auto-penned. But the signature on that letter that was released doesn't really resemble closely. I mean, you could talk to somebody who collects political items for a living and they could tease out all kinds of details that are beyond my ability to notice or recognize. But it seems a little off. Was he under duress? Was this someone very reluctant to issue this? We could speculate all day long, but my what I noticed was what you did was it was unusual.
That is extremely unusual, and that's an interesting point that I haven't really heard anyone talk about, was not only the letterhead but his actual signature. So you're saying the signature on this statement that he just released is different than his usual signature?
It is a little different, and I'm not suggesting that maybe a member of the deep state issued it by under his signature or signed his name, but it's a little off. It's not his normal. He has a very eloquent signature. I mean, all presidents, they've signed their name enough times. It's like those of us who are sports fans who collect autographs in our favorite sport. I mean, there's a certain art or flourish to signatures. This one was not was not polished. It was much more. I don't know. It looks almost sort of hasty, or something's not. It's sort of like if I were to sign my name. I'm right-handed. If I were to sign my name with my left hand, it would look close, but it clearly wouldn't be the same signature.
Hmm. Yeah, that definitely opens up the door for a lot of speculation. Was it him who actually issued the statement? Is he in that rapid of a cognitive decline that his signature has changed? Definitely a lot of speculation. I don't like to get conspiratorial though, but you did bring up an interesting point, and this is one of the pressing questions, especially one that Republicans are hammering on him. Speaker Mike Johnson came out with a statement: if you're not fit to run for president, you're not fit to be president. So how do you think he's going to explain himself in stepping down from the race but remaining president?
Oh, I mean, this is going to be tough, and there's lots of ways to look at it, because I think that's the argument, and I think the argument is not just won by Republicans, but even from within his own party. It really depends what motivates President Biden at this point. I mean, if he really is behind a Harris presidency, then maybe stepping down would be the best possible endorsement he could give, because he could give her a few months of on the job training, and we would see pretty quickly whether she's up to it or whether she's not. But I don't see that he's going to be willing to do that, and any other technique like pushing him out constitutionally, or invoking the 25th Amendment, or whatever it might be, that just gets messy. And I think if there's one thing Democrats are trying to avoid, even more than losing the presidency, and even more than losing the House and Senate, is having an open civil war between now and November. And I just don't see how you can take him out of the presidency without having that kind of civil war. So the argument is there. I think it's something we can discuss. At the moment, I just don't see a bridge to that outcome.
Yeah, no, I definitely do not think he's going to step down as president. I mean, I really think it comes down to two reasons why he's stepping down. And I think it's a little bit of both. On the one hand, he's probably stepping down because he's seeing the polls that are coming out. Trump has been hammering him in the polls for the past couple of weeks, maybe even months at this point. He's winning in all the swing states. I think the real clear polling average, he's up by like 3.5 points. And then on the other hand, it's his senility, his cognitive decline, the reason he's stepping down. And if that were the case, then he's not fit to remain president. But you're right. There's just no way he does, because it would explode the Democratic Party. It would be very messy because Kamala's, I think she's definitely going to be the candidate. And a lot of Republicans are asking, well, why won't she invoke the 25th? But you're right. It would probably just be very messy.
Yeah, so I think first I would suggest, let's take Harris. Harris is in a difficult spot. I do think at this point, in terms of my 68 book, we're moving beyond the Johnson chapter to the Humphrey chapter. And what I mean by that is Harris is really in a tough spot because there's almost no precedent at all for what she's facing in terms of, there have been, since World War II, there have been a handful of candidates who are either vice president or very closely connected to the outgoing president who were suddenly thrust into a campaign. The only one that's been successful is George H.W. Bush in 1988. But that's different because, of course, Reagan was term limited. And I say this, it's why it's a unique challenge for someone running in this role, because you have to run on continuity and change simultaneously. That's the hard thing, because you have to both be a candidate and be your own person, but you represent the administration. I mean, just something as minor as, which I see no one raising yet. Does she appear during campaign stops with the vice presidential seal? Which obviously gives her credibility right from the start that just another candidate wouldn't have. I mean, she has an institution behind her. But at a certain point, once we become accustomed to that, it's a reminder that she's tied to an unpopular president. So Hubert Humphrey, for example, was advised by his inner circle to resign from the vice presidency. That way you can dedicate all your time just to running for president, not being vice president, tied to an unpopular president. He thought that was a betrayal of LBJ, that without LBJ, he wouldn't have become vice president. And so Humphrey found a compromise that after September 30th of 1968, he stopped using the seal. But I would imagine there's people in Harris's inner circle who say you need to declare your independence. But her challenge is this: she needs to come out of the gate strong. She needs to knock heads. She needs to bring the party together. And we're going to see pretty soon whether she's capable of doing that. I say that because if she stumbles in her opening days and opening weeks, it is not going to be long until there's talk of replacing her. In 1968, not long after Humphrey made his debut, Johnson allowed leaks to come out that he was thinking of re-entering the race and coming back in at the convention in 1968. So again, history doesn't predict the future, but it does illuminate possible paths forward that I think it'd be good for us to dust off and become acquainted with.
Yeah, that's probably my most pressing question when I look at this, because we talked about last time with Humphrey. It's very, especially with an unpopular presidency, it is so difficult because she's between a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand she has to set herself apart, right? The candidate of change, of growth and everything. But on the other hand, she was part of this administration. She has to stand up for their record, which was an unpopular record. So, what do you think her game plan is going to be to do that? Because Humphrey had such a difficult time with it.
It really depends on what her goal is, because while the goal might seem obvious, it's to win. You have to break down the various possibilities here. everything she says is going to be measured against her past statements. So every new idea she has, the critic is going to say, if it's such a good idea, why didn't you do it the past 4 years? So she has to both argue that she's going to continue the great the accomplishments of the administration, but that she somehow has all these new ideas that only she can implement. So she's got to be really careful to claim Biden's assets, but not be saddled with his liabilities. And most importantly, everything she says is going to be measured for possible distance between her and Biden. And every time she says anything that's perceived to be slightly different, to go a little further on this policy, to spend a little more or a little less over here. I mean, imagine the first press conference when she's asked her opinion on Israel and Hamas. If there's a paper's width of difference between her and Biden, that's the news story for the day. It's still his policy during his remaining months in office, but now she's suggesting something different in the future, a different possibility. So that's going to be the story, for the rest of the time, and she's going to be under pressure to shift left, just as if a Republican were joining and would have to shift right. She needs to whip up enthusiasm in her party, and the enthusiasm comes from the activists, from the left wing. By shifting left, like Humphrey in 68, she concedes an even bigger road to the White House for her opponent, Nixon in 68 or Trump in 2024. So that's the challenge. She needs to remain tight with Biden and not betray him or seem disloyal, but she needs to whip up enthusiasm. Being a Biden surrogate, it's not exciting. She needs to be the anti-Biden.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think I sort of disagree with that strategy. I mean, obviously she's in such a difficult place right now because she's going to get those questions like the Israel Gaza war. But I think looking at this election, if this election is a referendum on Donald Trump, Trump loses. If it's a referendum on the Democratic, well, it was Joe Biden, but the Democratic nominee, they're going to lose. I really think she needs to do her best, looking at this strategically, she needs to do her best to shift as much of the attention to Trump as possible because now the whole election got completely uprooted because if you look at the Republican strategy, they were hammering Biden on his age. They were hammering him on his senility. And now they don't have that bargaining chip anymore. So I think one of the main points that Kamala is going to focus on is hammering Trump as the age guy, the old guy who's too senile to run. He needs to step down. So I think she needs to shift as much of the attention to Trump as possible because those questions, like you said, if there's a paper thin margin in her answers between her and Biden, it's going to go horribly for her. So she needs to do her best at answering those questions, upholding the record, and suggesting good change and growth and suing for peace while also shifting the attention to Trump and the whole age thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, and I think her other challenge is that the way I look at the current configuration of the Democratic Party is it's almost like three corners of a triangle. You have the Clinton wing, you have the Obamas, and then you have I would normally say the Bidens were sort of part of the Clintons, but you have what's left of the Biden infrastructure. And the challenge is who can unite those three sides of the party. After 8 years of Obama or 8 years of any president, I would say to you, if you want to know who's running that party, it's that president. But after 8 years of Obama, if you were to ask, I think most people who runs the Democratic Party, they'd probably say the Clintons. And I think similarly today, who runs the Democratic Party? I'm not sure. I mean, it's partly Obama and his actions recently, which are certainly alleged behind the scenes, or Nancy Pelosi's role as a kind of eminence grease. The Clintons came out and endorsed Harris right away. What does Biden really think, and what do the Biden people really think about being dumped by all these people who are now praising him for being a hero and for being selfless? I'm not sure there's a single person who can unite all these wings of the Democratic Party. So, to your point, the more they can make the focus to be about Trump and character issues and age, delays and defers indefinitely the need to deal with those internal issues.
Yeah, that's a great point about that triangle. And I think an important thing to mention, I don't know if you saw this, but Obama came out with a statement and he had a very glaring omission in which he did not endorse Kamala. Do you think that's significant?
I think it absolutely is. You look at the top leaders of the party, and none of them have come out and endorsed Harris. Not Obama, not House Leader Hakeem Jeffries, not Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. I would have added Pelosi just recently, but she's now just come out and issued kind of a tepid, endorsement. But it makes me wonder whether the rest of them doubt whether she's going to come out of that gate strong. If she does not have many moments, if her first speech isn't good, she better fix it by her second one. If her first question in her first press conference isn't solid, she's got to right that ship quickly. I think the attention span that people will have with her is even less than they had with Biden since that debate performance.
Yeah, I agree because looking at her polling numbers and her approval rating, I think her approval rating's maybe in the mid 30s, so she's not exactly a very popular candidate. Do you think there's any possibility of anyone else aside from Kamala?
It's tough, because are we playing for 2024? Are we playing for 2028? Given the historical cycles, if Trump wins, then the odds are on the Democrats for 2028. And if you're a leading contender, and you run this year, there's no guarantee of another shot at it in 4 years. In fact, odds are you're not going to get another shot. They're going to look to move on. And so another theory entirely is the reason they're endorsing Harris is not because they believe in her and not because I think she has a real chance, is because they want to flush her out of the system. If you're a Gavin Newsom or someone kind of waiting in the wings, you don't want to dip your toe in the water this year. The issues are simply not favorable issues for Democrats. Even Hubert Humphrey, he did not have favorable issues to run on 68. So instead, what he shifted to was creating a sense of nostalgia for what Democrats have done for Americans historically. So talking about FDR and Truman, New Deal and Social Security and jobs and the economy and unions, she doesn't have a lot of specific issues, maybe other than having a more popular position on abortion than some Republicans. But the issues are not natural Democratic issues. And if I'm a future talent in the party, I'm going to think long and hard about if I'm going to get one shot at it, wasting that shot this year when it looks like Republicans might be more united. And typically, the party that's the more united is the one that wins. Republicans might be this is the most they're united since maybe 1980 with Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, 100%. That Republican National Convention, I watched most of it and it was just screaming, unification around Trump. But I think abortion probably will be Kamala's biggest bargaining chip. I think a good strategy for her is she's going to hammer on abortion, which is it's so difficult because Trump really took the middle ground with abortion. He came out and talked about give abortion to the states. He didn't come out, gung ho pro life. He talked about the abortion pill and he's not necessarily against that. So he kind of took the middle ground, which was a good political move. But I think Kamala's really going to try to hammer abortion as her main issue and try to coalesce all those single suburban women in the Democratic Party to kind of boost those votes. But you're right. That's such an interesting aspect of this election because a lot of those Democrats waiting in the wing, Josh Shapiro out of Pennsylvania, Gavin Newsom, they're looking at this and they're saying this is a disaster for the Democratic Party. If I'm going to have any sort of ambitions of higher office, I'm waiting till 2028 because this is not the time to get in. And Kamala, she sort of lucked into the vice presidency, and now as vice president, this is her chance. That in 2028, she's probably going to be irrelevant. This is her chance. She's got to go now, but it's going to be very difficult to coalesce support and get a good VP candidate because a lot of those guys are sitting by and like, I'm not trying to get involved with this. I'm going to wait it out until 2028. And I think an interesting choice is Gretchen Whitmer out of Michigan because on the one hand, Michigan's a very important swing state, so that's a good political move. On the other hand, it would give the first all-female ticket, which is very, very interesting, and I think could really hammer that abortion issue. What would you think of that, the all-female ticket?
I'm a bit of a cynic in politics, and I think sometimes a political party knows that it's just not their year, and so their ticket becomes more of like a lifetime achievement award, or perhaps setting up the next generation, or sort of teasing the future of the party. And this has been going on a long time. I remember when I was younger, Bob Dole in '96. A lot of times it's someone who's done a lot of good service for a party who is running against an incumbent, or the odds are long right out of the gate. So I think I think if the insiders decide that, you look at the swing states, can Harris really do better than Biden in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio? Doesn't look like it.
Yeah, the polls aren't showing that.
She's not. She's going to be weaker than Biden with men, especially white men. Then maybe it becomes a ticket. Like you described, sort of tease the future direction of the party. But at the end of the day, that future direction needs to be able to win elections. And so it's going to be interesting. I think the choice of the running mate, if you're a future talent in the Democratic Party, do you take a chance with her or not? Does your reputation, does your star actually not rise by being a running mate with her? I don't think she'll get another chance. Just odds are, if you're a running mate with her, you might get another chance in 2028, and this could raise your profile. But it's really interesting to know, like, what are we playing for here?
Yeah, I think that's probably going to be the next catalyst. Aside from her initial press conferences and speeches and how she approaches it, is who does she pick as the VP? Because that can really boost the ticket in her favor. But speaking of the insiders, I want to shift to the convention and the whole situation with the delegates, because another thing that Republicans are absolutely hammering them on is the party of democracy is violating democracy because Kamala never received any votes in the primaries and now she's going to be the nominee. So Joe Biden went through the primaries. The people elected him as the candidate, and now he is no longer the candidate, and the primaries are over. So, how does that situation work with not getting any votes, probably going to be the candidate? And I mean, how did Humphrey approach that? Because did LBJ step down before the primaries? Did Humphrey get the votes in the primaries?
So I think the short answer is they'll just change the rules. They'll change the rules to make sure their procedure followed the rules. Humphrey in 1968 did not enter any primaries. It's not to say that he didn't have surrogates out there or people kind of using his name. Johnson was on the ballot on some primaries, but he didn't campaign at all. There was no infrastructure, as far as I know. He had some people on the ground in some places, and the convention was still largely an LBJ convention. That's going to be another fascinating thing to see this year. Is the convention still going to be run by Biden people or run by Harris people? And in '68, the rest of the election was still largely run by LBJ. So they released the delegates to Humphrey. There was the question, just like this year, there's a question of the fundraising and the money. But the challenge there is now Biden's got to shift the legacy, and he's got to start a presidential foundation. He's got to start a presidential library. And if the Obama library, which is going to be when it opens, the most expensive ever created in South Chicago, it takes about the same amount of money to build a presidential library as it does to run a campaign, about $1 billion. And Biden's getting to tap a lot of the same donors, that Harris is getting to tap this year. So it's just there's going to be a constraint on resources, within the party, despite the rules and the politics and everything else. I think they'll get around the rules by simply changing the rules. I think that's what political parties on both sides do. They'll find a way to do that. But who is going to open? The donor class is not going to look at California, and they're not going to look at Florida and Ohio, which went Trump, 8 points 2 times, even in 2020. They're going to look at the swing states. And if the donor class doesn't see return on investment, I don't see them opening their checkbooks.
I'm glad you brought up fundraising, because that's one of the reasons that makes me confident that Kamala will be the VP, because I've heard about the rules with fundraising. If there were to be another candidate that came forward aside from Biden or Kamala, the campaign funds that have already been raised for Biden wouldn't be valid to be used for that campaign, but they can be used for Harris. So she can already step into the fray and use the campaign funds that have already been raised. But you're saying that Biden's legacy with the presidential library and the foundation is going to hinder that?
With LBJ, LBJ immediately shifted to the building of his presidential library and School of Public Policy at the University of Texas at Austin. And he was tapping, some of the same donors, kind of Texas oil money, kind of Johnson good old boys from his political career. and there's only so many mega donors that you can go to. And so that's going to be, a tough, one of the most important lessons of 1968, and what made my book different than the ones before it, is everyone assumed once the president stepped down, he was irrelevant at that point. He was a lame duck. And a withdrawal from the ballot is not necessarily a withdrawal from politics. There's an enormous amount that an outgoing president can do or cannot do to help or to hinder. Short of, and I don't mean the usual tools, an endorsement, withholding an endorsement, just little things like, how the bills are paid and how the money's divided. I think there's further details on the donations. Some are given for the primary phase of the campaign. Some are given for the general election phase of the campaign. And so it wouldn't surprise me, in the truest sense of the American political system, that a lot of this ends up in the courts to be decided, and there simply isn't time to deal with that. While Harris is getting up to speed, really at warp speed.
Speaking of time constraints, I've heard that there's also going to be issues with deadlines on ballots because some of the states have deadlines to get on the ballot prior to the DNC. And if the Democratic Party kind of stretches this question of who their candidate's going to be until the DNC, they're going to run past some of those deadlines. Is that going to be an issue with the ballots?
Yeah, I think you have the deadlines, but you also just have this. It's going to take a serious education effort to educate Americans on what they have to do. I vote in Ohio, and in Ohio, I'm going to be out of the country in the UK for a lot of the fall. So I had to figure out, how do I do this? Do I need an absentee ballot? Do I need an overseas ballot? Do I vote with the military ballots? Is it considered a mail-in? Or, I mean, you have to figure out how to do this. And if you have, this is going to be, the odds are already long for Harris in a perfect world. But if you confuse people, if you have a state where, the vote for Biden, the line for Biden is really a line for Harris, sort of like, oops, the ballot was printed beforehand, or, if there's any kind of confusion at all, it's just going to make it that much tougher.
I think that raises a whole nother series of questions for the Democratic Party because voters, one of the biggest things in winning elections is getting voter turnout. And if voters have to jump through all of these hurdles to cast their vote for a candidate that they're not necessarily too enthusiastic for, they may just be like, you know what, I'm not going to go through that. I'm just going to stay home. And that's going to be a huge problem for the Democratic Party.
Yeah, the whole outcome, as you say, could be decided not on enthusiasm, not on donations or campaign ads, but simply who stays home. And anybody who goes through sort of a political science classes or a public policy program will see, even on days that it rains, turnout's affected, or it's too hot, or it's too cold. I mean, when elections are decided so narrowly, all you needed is the smallest detail to change that invalidates one of your assumptions, and thus the result shifts.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest stark contrasts between the Trump campaign and whoever the Democratic candidate is going to be is Trump has a base. He has a very strong base. There is no denying that. The Republican Party is unified behind Trump and they're enthusiastic about him. So they probably will stand in long lines. They'll go in the rain to cast their vote for Trump. I don't think you can say the same for Kamala, for example.
And Republicans tend to vote in much greater numbers on election day. It's sort of, many sort of traditional conservatives that I know believe it's sort of a patriotic duty to take time off. It's when communities come together. They recognize the poll workers and volunteers who are there. They've seen many times over many electoral cycles, whereas Democrats have the huge advantage on different forms of early voting. So that's another thing. But I would also add, it's not all bad for the Democrats. In addition to the point that you raised, which is if they can make it more about Donald Trump's character and legal problems, which seem to be mostly evaporating, but not entirely, as well as his age. That's one factor. But another is that Democrats know who they're running against. And so regardless of which name they're going to insert at the top of the ticket, they know who they're running against. Whereas I noticed even here in Ohio, the campaign ads, Trump's, as of yesterday, now have shifted to more of a general message about the administration and policies, and almost more like an "Are you better off?" 4 years later, and because they don't know, who it's going to be. So there's it's not all bad for the Democrats by withdrawing so late. You deal your party a disadvantage because you don't give them much time to organize, but you also don't give Republicans much time to organize either until they know who your candidate is.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think that's definitely one of the Democratic Party's biggest advantages is they do know who they're running against, so they can sort of seamlessly continue their campaign of hammering Trump. And with the Republicans, their whole campaign strategy has been upended. And I think another interesting thing to watch in the coming days and weeks is how fast they can adapt and adjust their campaign strategy and how successfully they will do so.
And I think if they can't run against Biden anymore, or the age, or the mental acuity issue, then they have to tie Harris to those same issues. That way, it's not much of an adaptation of their message, and that makes it more likely, I think, that Harris declares her independence from Biden. Because the more that she declares her independence and her separation from Biden's policy issues, the harder it will be for Trump to pivot and shift in that message, because it's they're not going to be able to blame her by associating her with an unpopular outgoing president as easily.
Yeah, I think that's what they're going to do because they can no longer campaign on the personality because Biden was obviously he was an easy target for that sort of campaigning. They're going to have to campaign on policy now and associate her as much as they can with the administration. And she's going to have to rebuttal that by setting herself apart and declaring her independence. But I want to talk about one of the most glaring parallels between the 68 election and today, and that's the convention. The Democratic National Convention is going to be in Chicago like it was in 68. Obviously, you have a very similar situation with the VP, probably going to be the candidate. One thing that I am very interested to see, it would be absolutely historic to watch and very exciting to watch, would be the possibility of an open convention. We're going into the Democratic convention. They don't have their candidate yet, and there's going to be a lot of lobbying and battles on the floor to figure out the candidate. Do you think there's a possibility of the open convention, or do you think they're going to sort of do the virtual roll call that they've been talking about and elect Kamala in advance?
It's a great question, and there might be certain forms of art and inventions that are used beforehand. I mean, I've seen in recent days now, state delegates are having Zoom meetings and sort of testing the waters and making sure they're standing behind Harris and there's not going to be any faithless electors, as they're called. So it seems like they're getting in line before the convention to reduce the chance that happens. We really haven't had open conventions in either party since probably 1952, 56, 52 certainly for the Republicans, with Eisenhower steamrolling the Taft side of the party. And then, 52, 56 with Stevenson coming in, having different running mates each time. That's probably the last time. Campaigns are so expensive now, and all politicians, don't forget, are conservative. I mean, sort of small c conservative, meaning they're risk averse. They want outcomes to be predictable. They don't want unpleasant surprises, with two outs in the bottom of the ninth. And so I think it's very unlikely that happens. I mean, it could look to the rest of us, who watch politics from the cheap seat, that it's an open convention, but actually it might have been a deal brokered somehow on the inside. Just like I suspect Biden's announcement was prepared some days in advance, even if we didn't learn about it until the last minute.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's definitely going to be a lot of behind the scenes lobbying, but I mean, maybe not because there was this one rule created in the Democratic convention that delegates are pledged to the president. And now that Biden, because going in, if Biden was the nominee, the delegates were pledged to him. They had to nominate him as the candidate. But now that he's stepped aside, the delegates are free to do as they choose. And Biden can endorse Kamala. He can do as much as they can, but they're still free to choose. They don't have to follow his lead. Do you think that's going to create a lot of problems for the Democrats?
I think the bigger thing, you're exactly right on the delegates. I think the bigger problem is going to be those delegates who are looking to see what Obama really thinks, or Jeffries or Schumer, who might be acting separately or in unison. And until all those Democrats fall in line before the convention, during the convention, after the convention, and get behind their presumed nominee, I think there's at least a 1% chance or greater that we're going to have an open convention, or that Harris might not be the one who runs. My gut instinct says that the fact that they haven't endorsed her is that they're not convinced yet that she can go all the way to November. And I think they're looking to her, just like a lot of other Democrats are, to figure out, how does she handle this pressure? It's been said on more than just conservative media in the past 24 hours that she's never won a single delegate or a single vote in a single primary. Not this year, not even in 2020 when she withdrew before the primaries really began. So she's got to go to these, she's got to do something totally unprecedented. I don't mean just in US history, I mean in her own political career. She's never won a state before, she's never had a single elector. And so she's inherited all of Biden's assets. But the question is, what does she do with that? What does she know to do with that? How does she transform herself, not overnight, but in a matter of hours, to become a candidate, to become the leader of the party and down ballot? How do people, and if you're a vulnerable Democrat in a House or a Senate race, is she? Do you want to appear with her in your race, in your district or your state, or do you want to stay far from her? I mean, there's lots of questions yet that we just haven't gotten to.
Yeah, she's got a very tall task ahead of her because she not only has to convince the American people that she's fit for the job, but she has to convince the Democrat heavy hitters like Obama, who haven't endorsed her, to come out in support of her and convince them that she's good. And then also the donors, all the congressmen. That's an interesting point with the congressmen because I know a lot of them were calling for Biden to step aside because he was hurting them in their races, in their congressional races. Do you think that that alleviates now that he stepped aside, or are they still facing those issues with Kamala?
It's going to be tough. Those first polls that come out, the only polling data that we have since Biden's withdrawal they've come out since then, but really the polling was taking place before he made the announcement. So we don't really have good polling data. I think that they're going to be watching that polling data. But I think the other issue is, one of the most important commandments in politics is ye shall not divide the party, no matter what. It's better to lose than divide the party. And typically when you show me someone who comes out and criticizes the head of the ticket, I'll show you someone who's just written their political epitaph. Even during Trump's darkest days after January 6th, those who came out against him, those who served on the J6 committee, they're gone. They're gone. Even though Trump didn't even, I mean, Trump was looked, on the surface at least, to be weak. And I think those who came out against Biden, while that was a popular move, it's going to be remembered by other Democrats going forward that you divided the party, and thus you made it harder for others, not just Biden, through what some will see as a selfish action or statement. So party unity becomes all that more important to put that in the past.
Yeah, that's going to be very important for the Democrats. Going back to the convention, I want to talk a little bit about, obviously in 68, there was a lot of rioting and chaos outside of the convention. Do you see that happening again? Because all of that chaos and rioting sort of stemmed from the Vietnam War and the anti war protests. And throughout this past year and election cycle, we've seen a lot of the same civil unrest with the college protests and a lot of the Palestinian protests and riots. Do you see that sort of civil unrest happening again outside the convention?
Go back to the awkward position of Harris. If she maintains Biden's position vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine, I think she's going to have that problem at the convention and elsewhere, and encampments returning to our campuses this fall. If she comes out, against Netanyahu, this week, who's in Washington, then it reduces that. Just like Humphrey coming out, separating himself a bit from Johnson on the Vietnam War, which is the popular protest issue of that day in 1968, that greatly reduced the amount of resistance and protests, against his own candidacy and his campaign. So, but for her to do that might seem like the easy thing to do, but it creates that division with Biden. So she's almost like a skier on two skis. You can't get out ahead of your skis or too divided, or you'll be split in half.
Yeah, and also like you mentioned earlier, she has to shift to the left, and that left would definitely be the more pro-Palestinian, anti-Netanyahu. And I think that's one of the reasons she's definitely not going to pick Shapiro from Pennsylvania, even though he's a moderate. He has the potential to get Pennsylvania, which is a crucial swing state. He's Jewish, and I don't think that those hard left pro-Palestinian voters would be very happy about that. And I think if she whipped out at the convention and picked Shapiro as her VP, I think we would really see some of that rioting.
Yeah, I think that's the main lesson is she can't be Biden. She has to have excitement. She has to be new. She has to be loyal to Biden, but offer something new at the same time, if that, contradiction is possible. And similarly, if somehow Trump were the nominee, he's going to have a challenger on the right. There's no space to his left because then you get on a head-on collision with the Democrats. There's no just like there's no space on Biden's right because then you make Trump look more acceptable as an alternative and you get in a head-on collision with him. So to excite she needs to excite the party and unify it quickly. And the way to do that is to appeal to the activist wing of the party.
It's going to be interesting because usually I feel like the candidate who's more moderate is the one who coalesces a larger, voting base. So I think that's a bold strategy to shift even more to the left because this has been a pretty left governing administration. So I think it's a very bold strategy to shift to the left. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. But expanding our scope a little bit, especially with all the foreign wars and the unrest abroad, what does it mean in terms of our foreign adversaries and the foreign wars now that we have a lame duck president?
Well, I think this is a scenario that concerns a lot of people on both sides of the aisle. Is the perception of American weakness. If Biden stepped down in part because people thought he was too weak to run for reelection, then what does that say about the United States, as a whole? And during his remaining months, while we're focused internally on our electoral process, our national security leaders, acutely aware of challenges to American interests abroad. Are they, cyber attacks? I've been saying for a long time, when are we going to have, an AI created video of Trump or Biden or maybe Harris saying something that isn't something they really said? That could cause, a national security issue. So I think now it is a very sensitive time, and I think leaders in our intelligence community and national security community need to be very aware of opportunism, that might be taken advantage of by foreign adversaries. So I think you're exactly on the mark there.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the scariest times in American history, in my opinion, because you have so many threats abroad. I mean, if I'm China, I'm licking my lips at Taiwan right now. If I'm Iran, I'm licking my lips at expanding my nuclear program right now. If I'm Putin, I'm licking my lips at getting a little bit more aggressive and trying to expand that territory.
Well, and it's also a question if you're a foreign leader, we there's a lot we don't know. I mean, we're spending most of this conversation talking about all the unknowns, but we do know one thing: President Biden is not going to be the next president after January 20th. So if you're a foreign leader, you're thinking in terms of your own national interests. Are you better off what? Moving now, making a deal with the Harris administration, making a deal with the future Trump administration. I mean, I think these foreign leaders are just as able to calculate this as we are here, and they're going to figure out what might be in their best interests. And I think they will respond accordingly.
Yeah, that's a great point. Do you think foreign leaders are going to be more inclined to support Trump or Harris? I mean, I know that's a very loaded question.
I think it depends on the issue. If you're Netanyahu visiting Washington, Netanyahu has said very nice things, about Trump and about his candidacy. And so, if I were Netanyahu, and I don't, I mean, I think the peace talks going on, and I think Cairo these days are somewhat secretive. I don't know that we know much about what's going on in there. But if Israel is sending representatives to those peace talks in Cairo, maybe I'd rather drag my feet a little bit, and hope that I'd rather make a deal with the Trump administration than a Biden administration.
Yeah, for sure. Especially when it comes to Netanyahu, I think Netanyahu's definitely going to be more pro Trump. He's obviously come out to be very much more pro Israel than the Biden administration has, and I know Putin has said that he wants Trump to win, which a lot of Democrats are hammering on him. But I think Putin wants to end the war too. So it's going to be interesting to see.
I, I think Putin wants an honorable way out, and I think the first American who can come up with some kind of a deal with Putin where he can save face and where it looks like a victory, and where we allow him to claim that without challenging him, is the person who's going to be a signatory of that agreement along with Vladimir Putin. So I think Trump, I'm not really sure what he believes, half the time. But you know, when you build skyscrapers in Manhattan for a living and in other big cities in the world, you have to learn how to cut deals. And you know that your enemy today can be your friend tomorrow. You've got to make deals with labor unions, political officials, legal officials, all types have to be cobbled together to build the building. And while I don't really know a lot of what Trump stands firmly for, I think he's someone you can make a deal with. And I think these foreign leaders, well, they don't like him, and he criticizes them sometimes. I think if you're a foreign leader, you'd rather make a deal with the devil that you know than an unknown in the future.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he literally has, a book that he wrote, The Art of the Deal. So this is a guy who loves cutting deals. He loves negotiating. I mean, speaking of Trump, what seems like ancient news now, the Trump assassination attempt we haven't touched on. What were your thoughts as that news broke and you watched that unfold?
So it's interesting because I was actually in the UK then. So I woke up early morning the next day and it's like, oh no, what just happened? And I spent about 2 hours like consuming as much news as possible. But what I said to the media who asked me was, you look at all the recent assassination attempts on presidential candidates, and so obviously, John F. Kennedy is the most famous in 1963. Of course, his brother Robert Kennedy in '68. I would put Martin Luther King in there too, because even though it was civil rights and he wasn't a candidate, clearly that was a highly charged political era. Of course, you've got Ford, two of them in 1975, only a few weeks apart. And then most recently, you've got President Reagan in 1981. And another one I'd throw in there probably is George Wallace of 72. Not a major candidate, but still, happened during the midst of a race, and it changed the outcome
Still
of the
political
race.
violence.
Exactly. And so I think that, where I come down is out of all those, you put all those together, the attempt on Trump did the least to stop his campaign and probably the most to invigorate it. I think there's so little that we know about the circumstances of the shooter. How could you be a registered Republican if you never voted in a campaign before? Certainly, he didn't vote for Trump. And so there's a lot I think we're going to find out yet about the motives of this shooter. But the fact is, he's done the most to boost Trump. And the timing of that coming on the eve of the convention united Republicans in a way that, I remember 2016 in Cleveland, and Trump came in and his entourage came in, and it's sort of like, who are these people? These aren't normal Republicans. They talk differently, their messaging is different. But it's sort of like, they went going along reluctantly with this new Trump phenomenon, but they were really outsiders. But they have moved from the outside to the inside now. And that lasting image of the close of the convention of Trump's whole family, even Ivanka and Jared and others who have been on the sidelines so far of the campaign, the former first lady, I think, that image is really what spelled fear for a lot of Democrats. Trump inviting his granddaughter, who's 17, to speak at the convention. You realize this is a big entourage, almost like a Kennedy clan. They're young,
That's what I was saying. That's what I was saying. I think the Trumps are the new Republican version of the Kennedys.
they're young, they're politically motivated. I mean, as long as you can hold their interest, and when they get tired of it, they'll go back to business, and building buildings. But I think that is the biggest shot across the bow for Democrats: is this is what your opposition has. What do you have?
Yeah, exactly. There's sort of political royalty now within the Republican Party. It's so funny how within 8 years, you're right, they came in 2016 as outsiders. Who is this guy? He's all flamboyant and pompous and talks crazy, has mean tweets, and now the Republican Party is completely unified behind him. It's crazy.
Well, I would say even the choice of JD Vance. A lot of people can't figure out, why would you choose someone Trump-like as a running mate? Because what does that really add after all? Other than obviously he's younger, being approximately half Trump's age. But I don't know. We'll be analyzing this all the way till November, and beyond. But as for me, as a sort of fellow blue collar, lower middle class kid from Ohio, just up I-75 from where JD Vance grew up, my take on that is Trump has already converted Ohio. Ohio was always a swing state. I grew up in a purple county in a purple state, is what I used to say. Ohio went 8 points for Trump in 2016 after going for President Clinton, 20 years before. And interestingly, 8 points for Trump in 2020, despite the fact that he lost. I think the move of Vance has different layers to it, but the one that stands out to me is ensuring that Ohio stays in the Republican column and doesn't go back to being a swing state as it was my whole life. But also, you look at Vance's speech. It's almost to me like something that could have been given by a blue collar Democrat a generation before or a union leader. His emphasis on the working man and wages and concern about free trade and acting as a check on China. I almost thought like if I had a bingo card during his speech and I could mark off the number of times he said Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Michigan or unions or workers or just the concerns of what used to be Democratic concerns that Democrats aren't talking about anymore. I think that Vance's sole purpose, if he achieves nothing else between now and November, to keep Ohio in the Republican column, which I think is a no-brainer at this point, but to make headway into Pennsylvania or to Michigan or Wisconsin, which are similar types of voters. If he does only that and nothing else, then Trump made a good pick.
I think it was a very confident pick from Trump because he doesn't necessarily have that pull of maybe getting Virginia. I think the governor or whatever from Virginia was kind of my pick for Trump, because if he would have won Virginia, it would have been a 40 state landslide for Trump. But he went with JD Vance, who I think was more so a confident pick from him because he doesn't necessarily have that pull like Pence did with the evangelical voters who were concerned about Trump's character. Maybe he just wants that loyal bulldog who's gonna fend for him and fend for his record and be that loyal. I mean, I guess he sort of has the blue collar pull.
It's that kind of hillbilly elegy thing. I think the question is going to be, I think a lot of staunch Trump supporters believe that as president in a second term, he's all powerful in the way that they see him. And what I wonder is whether that's really true, because Trump never facing voters again in a second term, typically second terms of presidents are not successful. And part of the reason they're not successful is because you're not all powerful. Even when you win in a landslide, like Reagan in 84 or Nixon in 72, because what you realize is from the moment you're elected, power begins to drain away from your body. Rather than be the all-powerful, president in a second term, most second terms are not successful. And what Trump supporters are going to realize is that power is going to begin to drain away from Trump the moment he's elected, because he's never going to face voters again. And so Vance potentially occupies this very awkward space where he becomes almost a bridge, not just to the future because of his age, but to Trump's own retirement. And as Vance begins to get more of the spotlight away from Trump, which I think is something Trump doesn't really want to share with anyone, it's not his style. There could be tension in that relationship after they're elected.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that was one of the main reasons he picked him. Why I say it's a confident pick, but I think he chose him in terms of his legacy. Because after this, this is his last shot. If he gets elected, he's president, and then he's probably going to disappear from political life. Maybe not his family, but he will. I think this is his legacy pick, that he wants to carry on his legacy. And I guess you could say the quote unquote MAGA legacy with Vance, who's such a young guy. But do you think it was a politically smart move? Do you think it boosts his chances or diminishes them?
Well, I think Vance is the first embodiment we have of a possible future vision of Trumpism without Trump. What does Trump's style look like? Does it last beyond Trump? I think Vance is a gamble that's maybe the form that it could take. If they hold Ohio and they get Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania, then Vance is going to look like a brilliant pick. If he doesn't chip away at those swing states that Trump needs, then people are going to point to that as the most important mistake of the campaign.
Yeah. I honestly, I don't see how he's going to increase Trump's chances in those swing states, because if you look at the polling, Trump was already polling well in those swing states, polling better than Vance was. So I really don't think he's going to boost his numbers that much.
Well, and Vance isn't going to hold the big rallies, the way that Trump is. What Vance might help to do is divide some of the labor. So if Vance can help to negotiate something with, UAW workers, or do something that Trump simply can't do himself, or maybe come in at the very end for the handshake, I think Vance could play a valuable role in terms of some of that ground game as a almost like an ambassador rather than a vice president for Trump. And so, will that be helpful? That might help. But the polls, as you say, already favor Trump, and I think it was a self-confident pick. He could have gone with, he could have gone with someone else who had greater outreach, say, with conservatives or evangelicals. And I think to your point about self-confidence, I think Trump is making a gamble here that those voters don't have anywhere else to go. That he already has them.
Yeah, for sure. I do think it's a little bit of a gamble. I want to talk a little bit about RFK. Did you see the uh the call that RFK had with Trump during the convention where he sort of called them up and tried to get him to drop out of the race to endorse him?
Well, I've heard two things from RFK recently. That apparently the audio of that call was leaked by somebody on the Kennedy side, which that's. I mean, I don't know that I haven't seen that Trump commented about that, but that's a no-no. So it does make me wonder about that. Because and the second thing I saw fascinating in the last few days is Kennedy now saying. If Biden had stepped out earlier, I didn't need to leave the Democratic Party. I could have competed at the convention for the nomination, which also makes a fascinating, possibility that does he switch back, and try to cause some havoc of his own in
I
Chicago
think
at
he's
the
trying
convention.
to. I think he's trying to.
And same thing there, as I asked before, what's his end game? It's still not any clearer to me today than it was the last time that we spoke. But to answer your question, I did see that call was leaked. And, I think these are the kinds of things that go on. I think on the Democratic side, the phone lines have been very busy, making sure that people line up in their endorsements of Harris and don't support others. And I think, Trump's playing the political game behind the scenes too. What surprised me is that rarely do these things become public. This is a view into a private world that usually remains private. And the fact that it was both recorded by Robert Kennedy, who claims that he was in the midst of some kind of a media interview and he did, it was inadvertently recorded was sort of the impression that I got. But that then it was also leaked. That's a bit, that's a bit risky in politics.
So, are you saying that you think RFK leaked it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the story that we're told is that he was already doing some kind of a media interview. And while that recording was running, it happened. What I read was that it picked up the phone call. But then there obviously was a second decision to release that audio to some friendly source.
Yeah, well, it was a video. It was a video. I saw it, and someone was videoing him talking on the speaker with Trump.
Well, that's what I mean. There was he claims that he was already doing a media interview, and that the recording is what captured that inadvertently. But then obviously there was a decision to leak that, and so I would not imagine as a staffer in politics you make any move without knowledge of the boss, because that's the end for you. So I have to believe that probably Robert Kennedy authorized the leak, even if he denies that, because it gave him a little boost in the media.
For sure. I think it's a good move, a good political move by Trump, because I know RFK is really passionate about the environment and health. So I think contacting him saying, if you endorse me, I'll give you Secretary of Health and Education or something. I think that's a good play by Trump.
Well, I think it makes Trump's point. Trump's point, whether one buys into it or not, is the Democratic Party has become a narrower tent in recent years. Kennedy's out, moderates are out, conservatives are out. Democrats, that's the argument of the convention. If you didn't need to watch much of what went on in Milwaukee to hear that. Trump's argument is that we're widening. We're welcoming all kinds of new people. Minority voters perhaps are giving Trump a look that they certainly did not in 2016 or 2020, especially men. I mean, the Republican Party is trying to widen at a time their criticism is that Democrats are narrowing. And so I think outreach to Kennedy might show Trump as a shrewd politician, maybe a side of him that we didn't think might existed before, and also show, in real time how he's trying to widen that tent.
Do you see RFK making any sort of move like that, stepping down, making an endorsement, or do you think he's going to stick it out to the bitter end?
It's a tough call. I think history is divided on that. An example is in 1968, Eugene McCarthy was kind of the wild card who captured the spirit of the left and the activists, and especially the anti-Vietnam War. His campaign started with a lot of enthusiasm and didn't really go anywhere, but he never really came around to endorsing Humphrey. Humphrey hoped he would come out of the convention, that was the time to circle the wagons, now that we know a nominee. And McCarthy instead went on vacation in France, conveniently right at that time. and eventually, I think in the final days of the campaign, issued a very sort of lukewarm endorsement of Humphrey, but obviously his heart and soul were not in it. So, there's different paths that he could follow. I think Robert Kennedy cares most what's good for Robert Kennedy and not necessarily what's good for a Democrat or for a Republican. And so I think he'll follow his interest right until the very end.
What did George Wallace do?
Wallace, what we don't know exactly, and Wallace didn't leave a lot of written records. Campaigns are notorious for not really leaving us a lot of records to go through in archives. I think people assume that Wallace, if Wallace had denied an electoral college victory, which was a possibility, to deny either side to get to 270, then Wallace probably would have cut a deal with the Humphrey side since he himself was a Democrat. But really, ideologically, he had more in common with a Republican, Richard Nixon. And so that's the question of Robert Kennedy. Set aside party labels. Who does he really have more in common with on the issues? Who does Joe Manchin have more in common with? Who do other moderates have? And, the answer might be Trump. And so he might not really endorse Trump, but, there's other ways of supporting him by not supporting people in your own party. So an endorsement really is just sort of one lever that he can pull. I would argue so far that Kennedy's campaign has given a better light to Trump than it has to Democrats.
Yeah, for sure. When you look at presidential elections, it seems that whichever party is hammering the independent or complaining about the independent is usually the party that's losing. And throughout this election, we've seen the Democrats complaining a lot more about the independents than the Republicans have.
Yeah, it's all going to be a question of which specific states and swing states is Kennedy eating into the race. I don't think he still has any chance to win overall, just like Wallace. But the question, in what states can he deny a victory? Can he play a spoiler? And can he do that in enough states to affect the overall outcome? That's still the question.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting. Looking at the election, I mean, it's so difficult to predict. We don't even know who the Democratic candidate is yet. Do you predict this to be a close one? I mean, anything could happen that could blow the gates open, but how do you see this playing out?
I can tell you what I think right now, but I reserve the right to change my mind in 30 minutes. That's been the cycle that we're in recently. I think as of right now, I think if most polls showed a slight edge for Trump, and I think most polls do lean Democratic in their methodology, because if you're running a polling firm, you don't run it out in Western Nebraska. You run it in the cities where it's easy to get 1,000 respondents quick. Well, then your respondents are usually going to trend Democrat, even if they say otherwise. So I think if the polls lean Republican slightly, then it's probably a few more points than lean. And so I think if that's where Trump is today versus Biden, I think he has a greater edge against Harris. And so if he can run the clock out with no October surprises and no dramatic legal things that could turn against him, as of right now, that's the outcome that I see.
Well, he does have his sentencing in August, I believe, right? It was pushed from July to August.
He does, and I think the court will.
That could be
The
bad.
court could also. Well, I've maintained from the beginning that there's a part of Trump. He does like to be a martyr. I think he is the strongest when he's backed into a corner. When his back is up against the wall, I think that's when he performs. I'm not saying he succeeds, but he likes the pressure of doing that. And to me, I think he probably daydreams about the idea of arriving at a debate between the eventual Democratic nominee this fall, and he takes off his orange jumpsuit on the stage in front of the cameras, and he has a perfectly manicured Brooks Brothers suit underneath with his red tie, and he's ready to go. Trump relishes the drama of politics. And he often, he leads in a direction of maximum drama. I don't think anybody wants to go to prison for a long time, but look at the sales of shirts, after the sentencing, the mugshot, the shooting, and everything. I think if Trump had to spend a few hours or an overnight in jail, I don't think he'd be opposed to that experience for the political benefits.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we've already seen so much thrown at him, and he already sort of has that martyrdom status, and his base is so strong. I think even a sentencing could boost.
No, you look at it, Trump in Trump's own mind, which might be a world that only he occupies. I think he defied the odds in 2016. He defied the Russian dossier. He defied impeachment not once but twice. And he's now defied even death itself. In his own mind. I mean, it's really almost like a messianic journey that he's on.
It really is quite poetic, but man, would it be a sight to see to watch him walk out on the debate stage, get his handcuffs, unchained, and go straight into a debate with Kamala Harris. That would be unprecedented.
I can think of no scenario where he would have, possibly more eyeballs on him than the one that you described right there. And I think that that's a factor that consistently drives Trump is getting the most eyeballs on him.
Yeah, but man, it's going to be interesting. We got to watch it day by day because news is coming in like a tsunami. So we're going to stay tuned. It's going to be a very interesting and chaotic 4 months. But Luke, I want to thank you so much for coming on and unpacking this all on such short notice. I really do appreciate it.
I'm glad to. If 1 human years is about 7 dog years, I don't know what the equivalent is in political years, but by November, that's going to seem like 20 or 30 political years. So we might have time for another round before November.
Yeah, it's insane. And if you guys want to go get some historical context to maybe help understand this election, go check out his book, The Year That Broke Politics, about the 68 election. It really is fantastic. I'll have that link down in the description.